It's really my pleasure to welcome all of you to St. Houston State University and the second International Conference on Renaissance Thought. Our mission as an institution is to provide educational opportunities for our students and our faculties, very simply. The value, however, of those opportunities, in my mind, is directly proportional to the richness of the academic culture in which we provide those opportunities. And there are very few activities on an academic campus, in my mind, that provide greater richness than the gathering of scholars to share their passion for their discipline. That passion, again, in my mind, is the real key to whole person educational, whole student educational experiences. So I'm grateful for having you here today. I'm grateful for the contribution that you're making to the academic culture of St. Houston. While you're here, I hope you have a little bit of time during your gathering of scholars celebrating beauty to enjoy the beauty of our museum grounds that are right behind you. The grounds here were the woodland home of St. Houston himself, who was a remarkable man. Served as a senator of both Tennessee and Texas, governor of both Tennessee and Texas, and first president, of course, of the Republic of Texas, and in general of the Texas Army. A remarkable historical figure in Texas, but throughout the United States as well. And that rich history, a lot of it occurred during his waning years. And he actually spent those years here on the grounds right behind you. But while in those waning years, St. Houston once said that nothing gives him greater satisfaction than knowing that his children will have an opportunity to receive an education. Ralph Waldo Emerson once said that an institution is merely the shadow of a single individual. So it's a great honor for us at St. Houston to provide that opportunity for all of his children within that shadow. It's a remarkable mission, it's a humbling mission, and it's a mission that we take to heart. Dr. Hill, I want to thank you and I want to thank everyone for what you're doing with this gathering to help us advance the academic culture of St. Houston State University and to enhance those opportunities that we provide for our students. Thank you, welcome, enjoy your conference.
Again, welcome. And now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Caroline Bruzelius. She is the A.M. Cogan Professor of Art History at Duke University, where she specializes in medieval cathedrals. She gets to teach wonderful courses like Gothic cathedrals and that kind of thing. She is also very involved in Wired. She can tell you a little bit more about that. She's focused her research on the architecture of medieval cathedrals. As I said, her numerous publications include Stones of Venice, the only book in English on the architecture of medieval Naples. And her most recent book was Preaching, Building, Burying Friars in the Medieval City. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Caroline Bruzelius.
So thank you very much for inviting me. I am delighted to be here on this beautiful campus. I was struck yesterday by the roosters crowing. This reminded me of my childhood in Brazil, and I thought, well, this is very poetic and lovely. I didn't quite know whose roosters they were, but now I understand they are official state of Texas roosters here at the museum, and I admired them at great length on my walk over here. So, Darci Hill, I want to thank you so very much for having the kindness to invite me to this beautiful place. And I just want to say that the book I wrote was not The Stones of Venice, which would be Ruskin, but I borrowed his title, and my book was The Stones of Naples in South Italy, and that came out in 2004. But today, I am going to speak about my first love, which is great big cathedrals in France, where I have also done a lot of work. And so we're going to launch into this lecture about big buildings, because there can be no more beautiful creation made by mankind, perhaps no greater expression of the human spirit of faith and of belief than the medieval cathedral. And whether we're looking at the outside of a cathedral, here you are looking at Chartres Cathedral to the west of Paris, or whether we're looking at the inside of Amiens Cathedral here, you can see that these buildings represent an extraordinary achievement, not only of reaching towards the heavens, but also, as it were, expressing the spiritual through architectural form. Now, what is a cathedral? I like to start with this very basic question, because in the United States, of course, we are not necessarily Catholics, and so we do not participate in the pyramidal system that moves from the parish to the cathedral, that is, to the diocese as a whole, and then through the representation of the bishop and the archbishop directly up to the papacy in Rome. So that pyramidal structure really means that the cathedral is God's house, God's representational house in each diocese. So it's very important to think of the grandeur of the cathedral, as you see it here, really as a culmination of an apostolic system, right, that goes right up, I should say, as a representation of God's presence on earth. We could spend hours, days and weeks actually, talking about the design and the structure of these magnificent buildings. This is the Cathedral of Beauvais, begun 1225. We could also spend hours, days and weeks, months talking about the beautiful stained glass window that you, I think, can see here at Beauvais, where the pointer is moving. I want to point out to you that by the time we get to a building like this one, which is more or less completed about 1267, we have clear-story windows that would be from here at the pointer to here, that are roughly 65 to 70 feet tall of glass, right? An extraordinary and complex accomplishment. So we could talk about many things that have to do with style, with structure, with technology, but instead, I'm going to do something else. I want to talk more about the social life, the social impact of building a cathedral. And I'm going to focus on several themes. One of them is the many lives of a building, how what we see nowadays has often been, almost always been, radically transformed from the way it would have looked when it was built. I'm also going to talk about the cathedral as a social space. That is to say, the ways in which cathedral spaces were divided for the clergy versus the laity, and this has some really interesting implications. I'm going to do a very mundane but fascinating thing, for me at least, talk about how you pay for big buildings, because if any of you have remodeled your kitchen, you know painfully well that architectural interventions are expensive. And your kitchen is one thing, but a Gothic cathedral is another. So how funds were raised long term, and remember here that we often are talking about buildings that take 60, 80, 100, 150 years to complete, sometimes that are never finished, in fact. And therefore, there has to be a kind of commitment of the clergy as a corporate entity to an enterprise of which they will never see the end. That's a kind of imagining of time that for us in the 21st century is really impossible, right? It's a kind of projection into a time beyond the time of the human lifespan, and that too is interesting. And finally, I'm going to close with some observations of cathedrals as centers of urban and juridical authority, what it meant for the bishop in the city to be the head of a cathedral. I'm going to talk about these themes. How's the sound, by the way? Yes? Okay. In relation to a series of buildings. One of them is a very small and not so well-known cathedral of Noyon. In fact, I had to write in the name on this map, but it's a great building and really very interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about Chartres, which is over here. Then I'm going to move to the east and talk a bit about Metz Cathedral. Metz has, because of its location, sometimes been in Germany, but nowadays it's in France. And then I'm going to move slightly north and conclude with some words about Reims Cathedral. You'll notice that these buildings are all in the area of the sort of northeast of Paris. And that's really very important because, among other things, this part of France has an abundance of excellent limestone. Excuse me. And you can't build a good cathedral without good building stone. So take that as a point of departure. So when we talk about cathedrals, well, we have to imagine them as encased in communities, right? Embedded in a town. And this 16th century image of Chartres gives us a very good sense of how the cathedral then, as now, right, soars above the landscape and soars above the city walls, you see them here, and the other many smaller churches that you can see projecting on the landscape. The cathedral declares its primacy through scale, through massive scale. But just as in this view of Chartres, those city walls and that neatly compacted and contained sense of the medieval city has disappeared in modern times, so just as the outside environment has changed, so has the interior environment, not only of Chartres, but most other cathedrals. So when we go to France or Germany or Italy, and we walk into these buildings, we often feel that we've stepped into medieval space. But I would like to make you aware that that medieval space has been profoundly transformed. And why is that? Well, one thing is the Reformation and the iconoclasm of reformers. Here we have a wonderful image that, from the early 17th century that shows statues of saints being taken off the pillars, right? Altarpieces being taken down, thrown on the ground and taken outside to be burned. So we have to imagine that our medieval buildings that now seem a bit empty once would have pullulated with sculpture, with painting, with hangings, with all sorts of interior decorations that don't survive. That is also true of the portals of a cathedral. And here we have a view of the Cathedral of Lyon on the Rhone River. This is the facade of the cathedral. Here you see a guy on a ladder, and he's actually hammering off the external sculpture. In France, a great deal of this devastation took place, of course, as a result of the French Revolution, right, where statues of kings and queens of the Old Testament, believed to be the kings and queens of France, were torn down and destroyed. My point here is an important one. If you go to a museum, if you go to the museums in Houston, if you go to the museums in Washington, you will see a lot of religious art. And that religious art is in this country because it was torn out of buildings in Europe. And so we wouldn't have our collections if these moments of destruction and iconoclasm had not occurred. Those were terrible events for our cathedrals, but worse still was the entire demolition of some very major and beautiful buildings. Here, for example, is a drawing of the Cathedral of Valenciennes in northern France. This cathedral has been entirely demolished down to the ground. Not a stone remains, and that is also true of the Cathedral of Cambrai and the Cathedral of Arras. Right? Many buildings were demolished, and this was the case as a result of the French Revolution. You probably know that, of course, all religious buildings became public domain and were used as quarries. That is to say, they were demolished in order to sell the stone. And Paris, 19th century Paris, a lot of the foundations of the 19th century city are made out of the rubble, right, of great Gothic buildings like this one, which is in fact the Franciscan Church of Paris, being demolished, in the process of demolition, by these so-called bandes noires. The bandes noires are these companies, free enterprise at work, right, who are bought these properties and are demolishing them and selling the stone. So medieval Paris, as you probably know, exists only in tiny little fragments precisely because of the systematic destruction. Well, this is a sad story, and it's going to get even worse. Because, of course, many of our cathedrals are in eastern France, and during World War I, the invention of new forms of artillery, of the beginning of aerial bombardment, wrought havoc on many of the cathedrals, like Reims Cathedral, which is in eastern France. So here you see the great cathedral taking a direct hit, the vaults exploding, leaving the building a wreck. This is how Reims Cathedral looked in 1918, with the whole roof structure burned off, the walls very heavily damaged. I am happy to be able to say that a great deal of the restoration of Reims Cathedral was paid for by American benefactors. And when you go now, and you should go, if you look carefully at the walls, though, you will still see the impact of shells where they damaged the stone. So that was very bad, World War I, and even worse was World War II. Because we have developed wonderful new systems, I mean wonderful in quotation marks, horrific new systems of aerial bombardment. And so Normandy in particular, and this is the city of Caen, was completely devastated by aerial bombs. Well, so it's in the frame of looking at buildings now as repaired, restored, renegotiated spaces, right? We need to be conscious of that. And even though I'm a deeply romantic person, I need to remind myself that when I look at a medieval cathedral, I'm often looking at a building that's as much a 19th or 20th century repair, right, than as the original structure. But let's move on to more cheerful and interesting topics. I want to focus on the cathedral precinct and the urban topography of the city. And I want to make the point that the cathedral is integrated into the city, but it's also separate. It's also another thing. And we mustn't be too simple-minded about our idea that the cathedral represents the urban population. So when we go back to Chartres, and I show you that view, we see that the cathedral is encased in the community. But in fact, the cathedral was a kind of precinct, a kind of reserve or preserve for the clergy. And let's use Chartres as a kind of case study for this. Here we have a magnificent building, by the way, not completed. So if you look here carefully, you will see the bases of towers. Here would have been a tower that would go up right here. Here there would have been a tower. So 2 towers on the transept arm, there would have been 2 more towers on the opposite side, and 1 huge tower coming up here. So this incomplete cathedral is truncated, and that soaring and rising phenomenon of this massive structure would have been all the more striking had it been completed as intended. But our question right now is the relationship of Chartres to the medieval city. Now here we see those city walls, as we saw from that external view, circumnavigating, protecting the town, even protecting, here's the river Ur, passing through, right? You can see that town access to the river for its mills and fullers, that too was protected by the city walls. Here's the cathedral, right up here. And if you look carefully at this map, you will see that it too has a wall. So we have something a little bit like an egg, right? With the yolk being the cathedral precinct and the shell and the white being the whole town. So we have a fortification within a fortification. And within that structure, we have various different dynamics. We have the cathedral precinct, as I showed you here. Then we have the precinct of the Count of Chartres. Now, as I talk today, I will expand on the idea that in some cases, the bishop of a cathedral is also simultaneously the count of the town. On the whole, that's a good thing. This was not the case at Chartres, where we have a count who has his independent jurisdiction, his prisons, his courts, his financial system, and we have the bishop with his independent legal jurisdiction, his courts, his prisons, and so on. So we have two parallel systems of governance in the town of Chartres. This is not uncommon, and I'm sure you can imagine, as people who work on the Middle Ages and the early modern period, this does not always go smoothly. That is to say, if a clerk from the cathedral precinct commits a crime in the town, who tries him? Or if one of the councilpeople hits that clerk over the head, who has a right to try that person, imprison him, and get the fines? This got very complicated. Complicated to the extent that there were real street battles in the town of Chartres over the rights to trial and jurisdiction over matters of all sorts of matters, economic as well as legal. Within the cathedral precinct, this is what we have. This series of streets here reproduces the wall that once contained the cathedral precinct. It's no longer there. It was separated by gates from the town because the bishop had his own currency. Remember, every town in the Middle Ages more or less mints its own coins, at least up for a certain period. There are money changers located at all the gates to the cathedral precinct. The bishop's quarters are up here. Nowadays at Chartres, that is a beautiful 18th century complex with gardens. So right adjacent to the cathedral on its northeastern side. The canons had their quarters right here. And there's one theory, in fact, that sometimes things in the town of Chartres became so violent that there were actually bridges, wooden bridges, like pontoon bridges, that went from the upstairs of the canons' quarters into the upper stories of the cathedral. This is controversial. I'm not going to spend time on it right now, but it's an interesting theory. And it's strange because this kind of contestation would have happened within the precinct, wall precinct of the cathedral. Then we have other parts of this complex of massive granary that is for grain storage, and this is very important. This belongs to the cathedral, even though it's outside the precinct, and this is where wheat could be stored. Important point for Chartres, because there is this illness that comes from fermented wheat, moldy wheat, ergotism, of which there is, for which there is no cure. But the Virgin and the Sacred Well and the crypt of Chartres were supposed to have miraculous medicinal powers to cure this illness. So it won't surprise you then that we have a huge hospital located here at Chartres. And indeed, one theory is that the crypt, people who were ill could even stay below the cathedral in the crypt to be in proximity, of course, to the relics and the holy water of the Sacred Well. And then we have lots of buildings, shops, stores, hostels, to serve the needs of pilgrims and the religious community. And it is thought that the workers who lived within the precinct of Chartres actually had something like a semi-servile position in relation to the cathedral hierarchy, that they were in fact serfs attached to the cathedral. This is again a complicated and not entirely clear matter for us now. Within the cathedral, and here is the cathedral plan, the nave, transept, and apse, right at this location here, can you see my pointer okay? Yes? There would have been, there was until the 18th century, a choir screen. And that choir screen was a substantial micro-architectural element. Here you can see it in an 18th century view. It had altars within it. Here's a ground plan that shows a choir screen. And this is the choir itself with the stalls for all the clergy, who were many, about 120 most of the time, the bishop's throne and the main altar. One interesting point is that in order to see the Mass on the main altar, you can see the door of the choir screen. You would have had to be, as a layman, aligned with that doorway, right? You would have had to be in a line of sight, so you could look through the doorway that is here, standing down here, and to look at the altar. So the main Mass, with these choir screens, was not visible to the lay public. Right? If laymen in Chartres, the townspeople, and it's estimated the population of Chartres in the 12th century was about 7,000 people, they worshipped for the most part in their own parish churches. And the cathedral served as a kind of representational building, but really not so much for the liturgy for the lay population of the town. And who, in fact, as you see very clearly from this view and from this plan, were in effect physically excluded from the space that contained, the walled space that contained the main altar here. Now, it's kind of shocking to a lot of people because ever since Victor Hugo in the 19th century, we've had the idea of the cathedral as being built by the people, for the people, a kind of great upsurge of public devotion and physical work, right, that would make these cathedrals come to be. But of course, you know that the kind of technical skill involved in cutting the stone and putting it in place could not be volunteer activity. People have their own jobs to do, and in fact, when we look at early views of cathedrals and reconstruct the choir screens that are no longer present, they were torn down almost always after the Council of Trent. So in the 16th century, we don't even have good views of these choir screens because they disappear so early. That this was a highly segregated space with the elite of the clergy separated off from lay people who might have done various things in the nave, but certainly not participated visually in the Mass. It does bring up, and I'll say this parenthetically, other interesting questions, one of which is, of course, then the role of bells, the role of incense, the role of sound become very important, right? The other senses are engaged in a kind of a participation in the Mass at the high altar, but certainly not the sense of direct vision, unless you're the lucky person standing in front of the door. So I want to turn to Metz to give you another interesting spin on this kind of idea. This is a fabulously extravagant and glorious cathedral. We see it today as one long, continuous space, culminating, of course, in the curve of the apse, the kind of constellation of windows, right, that bring in the light over the main altar. But in fact, how many lay people, I assume most of us in this room are laymen, would have actually participated in this church? Well, in fact, if you turn around and look the other way at Metz, you can, and this is the kind of thing that architectural historians do, and I think most of you are in literature and in history, so I am like a creature from another planet here. But if you look carefully at the piers, you know, the parts of the building, like the supporting elements, you'll see these piers are made up of a central core with added shafts, and that's the case all the way down the nave. Until you get to the west end, the entrance, and here you see some very simple piers, just simple columnar piers. Those are the remaining parts of a separate compartment of this cathedral that was intended for the lay public. Let me show you here on the plan. So here we have, when we get to this point, those simple columnar supports Whereas all the rest of the church has it's more complicated, much heavier. And here you also see a little apse. And in fact, what you are looking at are the remains of a separate parish church that occupied the western bays of the nave. That is to say, there was a parish here. In fact, at Metz, this great Gothic doorway at the west end of the church was added in the 19th century. There was no great portal here. The parish entrance was through this door and this door here, right? This is 19th century, and there was a wall that separated the parochial functions that would be, baptisms and weddings and funerals, right, from the great liturgy that took place for the canons and the elite in the eastern part of the church. And the eastern part of the church is most of the building. Right? So although our numbers and population are very different, the lay public must have been many more, right, than the canons and the bishop. Nonetheless, the majority of the space is consecrated in the sense of being God's house, right, to the masses performed by the clergy for the clergy. And here, I don't want to suggest that the lay church, the parish church, was any mean, nasty kind of thing. It's a beautiful little building. And here we are standing in that lay church, looking towards the apse, looking towards the altar and its windows. And we see that we are, even in this lay church, smaller than the cathedral, but still a gloriously beautiful Gothic space. So on the one hand, we have the lay church at the west end, with the apse facing south. And here we have the canonical church facing east. So churches adjusted to lots of local kinds of situations. And sometimes those are hierarchical and having to do with different categories of people. But sometimes they have to do with very practical concerns. And I forgot to show you on the map the Swiss Cathedral of Lausanne. But I love this example because this cathedral, again, at the top of a hill, sort of overlooking the city, is a wonderful example of practical solutions. We see it today as a unified building, whether we're looking at it from the outside or we're looking at it from the inside. And here we are looking down from the altar area towards the western entrance. You see one long continuous space. But till the 19th century, the church actually stopped here. Here's the west facade, and there was a street running through it. And why was that? Because the market was located up here. So in order to get to the market, the cathedral was not able to completely block off the street. What they did was to create a kind of covered corridor to get to the marketplace. This has been reconstructed to look like this. So we have the cathedral on one side, we have its west facade on the other, and the road runs right through it. It reminds me of the title of that wonderful novel, A River Runs Through It. In this case, it's a road runs through it to take goods to market in the most practical and direct way. Again, in the 19th century, under the great restorer of Gothic cathedrals, that street was suppressed. The cathedral was connected up, and now, of course, you have to circumnavigate around it to get to the market, which is still located up this street, right? So this practical solution is banging right through here. You can see this niche in the plan right here and right here, but this is where the road ran through, right on axis with the main access to the market. So again, a building that has been profoundly changed by the passage of time and the modification of the structure to modernize it or to suppress certain kinds of features that to us now seem kind of charming and comical, but in the 19th century, with the idea of unity and harmony and so on, were not acceptable ideas. So let's jump around France and turn to this wonderful cathedral. You see again in the 16th century view, the Cathedral of Noyon. Here I would like to talk for a few minutes about how urban topography conditioned the construction and even the appearance of the cathedral. Now, you have to imagine this, that in the Gothic period, when we're building a cathedral, we're always building a much bigger church than what had been there before. right? The old cathedrals were replaced because they were not modern enough, they were not large enough, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy were in a kind of competition to create dignified and worthy buildings, indeed, that represent the house of God and the diocese. So whenever in a town like Noyon or Chartres, you're going to expand your cathedral, you're going to have an impact on the town. And these towns, in the 12th and 13th century, are exploding with population growth. We all know that the Middle Ages were a period of enormous population growth, and this affected towns most strenuously. Property became more expensive, cities became more crowded, so when you want to make your cathedral bigger, you have an impact on that packed-in environment of houses, and you need to figure out how to do this. Now, in the case of Noyon, we're in a part of France that is incredibly rich. Incredibly rich partly because of its extraordinary agricultural terrain. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But also, as you see, we're near the English Channel. And from England is being exported vast amounts of wool, right? Vast amounts of wool that are going to make the wealth of England in the Middle Ages with this growing population that needs clothes, right? And it's also going to make great wealth for all these towns in Normandy, in the Pas-de-Calais, in Picardy, like Amiens, like Noyon, that are receiving this wool, treating it, dyeing it, and shipping it off or selling it. So we have a great trade that's based on this fragile material, which is cloth, which we need every day, and which was ever more necessary with this population spike. At the same time, you need more food. And I simply love this view of the farmlands in Picardy. It gives you a sense, maybe like here in Texas, right, of this wonderful, fertile farmland on which the wealth of the diocese was based. So when we turn to the Cathedral of Noyon, we have actually an early Gothic building. It's begun probably around 1140. We're not terribly clear on the date. It's not the biggest of the cathedrals because it is an early one. The nave is only 29 feet wide. That's about, well, maybe 2/3 of the width of this room. And the vault is 74 feet high. So it seems very tall, but it's actually not necessarily a big building. When you look down this view, you don't see one thing that I'm going to show you, but it's really a very fascinating thing, and that is when they began to build this cathedral, they were building it inside, on the site of an old cathedral that's here. Can you see my pointer? Yes, right? Oh, that was here. Inside, and the dotted line represents the Gallo-Roman wall, the protective wall that was put up in the 4th century in all French cities, right, to protect them from the barbarian invasions. The old cathedral was just inside. That Gallo-Roman wall also had a moat on the outside. And the cathedral, when it is going to expand in the Gothic period, is going to have to break through that wall, that kind of girdle that holds the town in place, break through it, fill in the moat. So here we are. This is the Gallo-Roman wall here. Here we have the area that would have been the moat, right? And the new cathedral begins to be built outside the walls. And you can see the first phase as this vertically striped masonry. They, of course, have to keep the old cathedral, roughly in the location of A, intact, right? Because the liturgy, after all, has to go on a daily basis, on and on and on. You need to start building your cathedral outside or around the older building, keeping the mass intact. So they go outside the wall, start the new cathedral, but look at this. The axis of the old building, A, goes like this. The axis of the new building goes like this. So when we look at a plan of Noyon, it's actually banana-shaped. You can see the building actually has swerves to one side, and that really has to do with the topographical conditions and the construction sequence of this building. They had to begin here to provide a new space for the main altar. and for the liturgy. And it was only then that this part of the building could be used, that they would then tear down the location of the old cathedral, which would have been here, and they didn't get the axis quite right. So you wouldn't know this when you step into Noyon, but that curve is definitely there. So here's another question about Noyon, which I think is really very interesting. This is built by Bishop Simon of Vermondois, who's a cousin of the King of France. How is he going to pay for this fancy new building? Well, he had lots of rights and privileges. He was a peer of France, that is a council of nobles, king's special council. It's a little bit like being in the presidential cabinet. He was also bishop, as it happens. He had 2 dioceses under his control. He was bishop of the diocese of Tournai, north in France. He had income from all the lands in his possession. And here I want to remind you of a very special thing. Of course, the property of the church is cumulative. So if you think about a diocese like Noyon, like the Diocese of Paris, that are established in the 4th, 5th, or 6th century, over the centuries, they are going to accumulate the properties left to them by donors and patrons. You're going to have each cathedral, and for that matter, every abbey church, right, supported by the revenues that come from patchworks of farms located throughout this wealthy agricultural area like Picardy. And he's going to have the income then of these many agricultural establishments in the possession of the diocese, as well as his own private income, of course. He can impose taxes. We'll talk about more of that in a minute. He can put taxes on guilds. He can tax ports and bridges. So Noyon has a very important river. The Oise River, every boat going along pays a tax, right? And mills and wine presses pay a tax as well. He can tax roads. So all those important roads carrying the wool from England down to Italy to the fairs of Champagne can be taxed. He can establish favorable rates of currency. Remember I said that each bishop had his own mint. And of course he has his own law courts, point number 8, right? So he has prisons and fines and so on for infractions of any of these taxes, among other things, not to mention crime. But there is more. There is more. He also he has the right of ton-lieu, which, that is to say, in the market of Noyon, he can tax all merchandise sold. Well, we do that in the States, right? North Carolina at 7.5%. He has a tax of rouage, which is a tax on carts that carry goods to market, tax on money changing. He has the right of jouage, the right to regulate weights and measures, and he can do that to his own benefit. He has the right of journée, the right to take from the market fruits and vegetables at no cost. And, sorry, I'm missing a few words here. And number 6, the right to buy animals and meat at a price that he establishes himself. Huh. Anybody here want to complain about their taxes right now? I know it's April 7th, but still, we're not badly off compared to a peasant or a townsperson in the Middle Ages, at least in the town of Noyon. Aside from number 7, income from rents, from produce, and from farms, right? So it's going to be this assemblage of resources and commitment long-term of these resources that's going to make the Cathedral of Noyon, or any other cathedral, possible. And I should point out, which I neglected to do, that the Bishop of Noyon is also the Count of the town. So in this particular instance, he has not only the rights of the bishop, but he has the juridical rights of comital authority as well as episcopal authority. So we're going to bring all this together in my favorite building, which is the glorious, highly repaired Cathedral of Clans in eastern France.
You will know this region because it is a region of the Champagne. Nobody here, I'm sure, is unaware of Champagne. But this was not necessarily the reason for the wealth of the Archbishop of Reims, which Champagne had not yet been invented at that point. So we see this spectacular facade, and this is kind of the culmination of Gothic technological skill. You can see how the facade has become almost like a web of masonry, transparent, so that you have these enormous stained glass rose window, not only at the west end of the nave, but over the portals down here. Glass. You can look right through the towers, and in some views you can even see glimpses of the flying buttresses that support the nave behind. So, spectacular technological achievement completed around 1320 or so. If we look at the position of Reims in the topography of the city, again we have a situation where we have the old late antique fortification, the Gallo-Roman wall here. You see some vestiges even of the Roman street plan. Here's the Cardo, for example. Perhaps the Decumanus is right here, right? And you can see the cathedral precinct actually occupies maybe 1/8 or more of the enclosed part of the ancient city. The later walls are fortifications that were put up in the 14th century. And those later on came to include the cemetery churches of Saint-Rémy and Saint-Nicaise, which would have been extramural cemetery churches when they were first founded to commemorate 2 martyred bishops. In late antiquity they are, in the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance, they are included in the wall, but in the original, of course, the cemetery, according to Roman practice, would have been outside the city. Well, we're just going to focus on this sort of pink patch here and talk about this area around the cathedral. Because when we look at the cathedral precinct, at Reims Cathedral, we see that the church, which is here, is only part of a much bigger complex that also was, at least for a time, enclosed in a wall. The sort of salmon-colored part on this side is the Archbishop's precinct. There's now, if you go to Reims, a fantastic museum of Reims and its cathedral in there. He had his own chapel, which is this structure here. So he had gardens and a great palace. This purple area is the quarter of the canons, this enormous area located here. We're going to look at 17th century views of it in a minute, but you might just note that we have 2 cloisters, one cloister here, one cloister here. None of that survives. And then we have the great quarter of the hospital located right here. So in this 16th century view, excuse me, you begin to get a sense of how this worked. We had the 2 cloisters of the canons, cloister 1, cloister 2. We have an enormous number of houses associated with the canonical quarter. They're all in this long rectangle. Here, these would be the canons' houses, their servants' houses, the houses of the shopkeepers who provisioned the religious community. They had an orchard and a garden located in this area. They also had, what is this? A prison. The Prison du Chapitre is located right here in that second cloister. So we have, in fact, a juridical component of the canonical community located here as well. Here's the hospital and all its buildings, very substantial, as you see, and located as a church outside the west portals of the cathedral. And here, switching to the right side, the south side, we have the bishop's prisons as well. So we have a very significant juridical component located on the archbishop's side. So the role of these cathedrals as having legal authority over the citizens of Reims is really very important. It's hard to remember this when we look at these places. All of these ancillary structures, none of the buildings of this cathedral complex survive in their medieval form, although the Archbishop's Palace is still there, rebuilt in the 18th century. But it might be interesting to remember that when we go to other cathedrals, we sometimes see parts of the complex that were associated with law courts and legal jurisdiction. And I'm showing you here the south transept of area outside the church at Strasbourg, where in fact there's a figure of Solomon and ecclesia and synagoga on the door jambs, which are the remaining component parts of some kind of open-air Episcopal court that would have taken place at that particular building. So we go back to Reims, and we see this building so much larger in scale, so much more extravagant, so much more technically advanced, so much more expensive than Noyon Cathedral that we were looking at before. And in fact, this cathedral, the Cathedral of the Archdiocese of Reims, is constructed in a period of extreme and difficult relationships with the lay people of the city. And that's partly because the combination of construction of the cathedral as well as, and this is important, the role of this cathedral as a coronation church of the kings of France meant that carrying forward the enterprise of the archdiocese was extremely expensive. We have some documents that attest to this. The cathedral is begun in 1210 by Archbishop Jaime of Brienne. The east part is built rather quickly, 21 years. We have a document that the choir is completed. But that it is being expensive is attested to indulgences, right? We have the first indulgence in 1221, another one in 1246, two in 1251. And we get a hint that there's stress emerging when we see that there are a series of coronations that need to be subsidized by the burghers of the city of Reims. The coronation of Louis VIII in 1223, unfortunately, he dies young, so his son, Louis IX, of course, Saint Louis, is crowned again in 1231. And those exactions, which can be imposed at will by the bishop or archbishop as count of the town, were obviously very onerous because in 1233, but they're not enough money, I would say. In 1233, the archbishop demands a percentage of the loan. So the burghers of Reims are going to make a big loan to two other cities, to the city of Troyes and to the city of Auxerre, and the archbishop is requiring a percentage of that. People by that time at Reims are pushed to the limit. There's a revolt. It's violent. The townspeople besiege the archbishop's palace. They attack the chapter. They kill their marshal. They take stones from the cathedral and use them as barricades in the street. And the situation is so alarming that the chapter and the archbishop flee the city and live in exile for 3 years. That's a dramatic event. It's not safe for them to be in town. We have analogous suggestions at other towns, one of which is Chartres. And so construction, of course, is interrupted for a very significant amount of time. Nonetheless, when you go to Reims today and see the completed building, no evidence, of course, of this tormented struggle to get the cathedral built is visible or evident. We see, in spite of World War I, a harmonious and completely coherent architectural structure. But I do want to point out, in closing, one particular detail that I think is quite marvelous, and that is Archbishop Henri's way of emphasizing, when he comes back to town in 1236, as he pushes the choir to completion in 1241, I'm the boss. And that is visible, not so much in this slide because the windows are bleached out, but we're going to move up towards this window on axis, as you can see, the main window that presides over the length of the nave of the church as you walk in towards the main altar, which is here. So in this main window, If we zoom up close to it, what do we see? Well, up here you see the crucifixion. You can just see the torso of Christ on the cross, flanked by Mary and St. John. You see the Virgin and Christ child. The cathedral is dedicated to Our Lady, Notre Dame de Reims. So here's the Virgin Mary, Christ child on her lap. You see a wonderful evocation of the cathedral itself, a Gothic building underneath the Virgin. So Mary also as the church herself, right? And what do we see right under the crucifixion? Archbishop Henry. Archbishop Henry, right there on axis, an enormous, huge figure, right? Henri, saying at the bottom, right? Who is emphasizing his handiwork in the most, if I may say, aggressive way. Well, so just to finish up, I can't resist putting in this remarkable painting by Hans Memling, of course, from the late 15th century. And it's a wonderful painting now in Poland, in Gdansk, Danzig, which shows the Last Judgment, of course, the archangel separating the saved from the damned, and the fate of the damned is not very pleasant at all. But when we turn over to the left wing of this remarkable panel, this remarkable altarpiece, we see the saved marching up in their naked little bodies, being greeted by St. Peter, who is here. And where does he bring them? He brings them into the great portal of a cathedral. So, thank you very much. So, Professor Hill says we have time for questions, if anybody would like to ask some. Oh, lots, yes.
It was really interesting to hear about the conflict, the legal conflict between the ecclesiastics and the civil authorities. I'm assuming that you're referring to canon law. And if you are, was there that much difference between the code of canon law and the civil law?
That's a wonderful question, and which I am not at all prepared to answer. My canon law, of course, is codified by Gratian, right, in the early 13th century. Some of these cathedrals are being built before that codification. Each town would have its own legal system. There was no unified legal system in France until Napoleon, I am imagining, although to some extent also under Louis IX. So I think that we would have a very, a patchwork of systems constantly being renegotiated with each other. But I'm not a legal expert, so I would defer to anybody here who knows more about this than I.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes?
You spoke about the financing of the building of the buildings. How about in today's world, the maintenance of those buildings has got to be staggering.
Aren't you glad you don't own a cathedral? Yes, it's staggering. And I think the best analogy is Washington Cathedral, where the building was completed not long ago, and before they even fully finished Washington Cathedral, they were already having to maintain and spend a lot of money maintaining the older parts of the building. Then about 4 years ago, there was an earthquake in Washington. The Washington Monument was in fact closed, as well as the cathedral, and those repairs are costing a staggering amount of money. It's not practical architecture. Yeah, but we don't, the really difficult thing for someone like myself is we don't have building accounts until the 14th century. So for the buildings I work on, 12th and 13th century, we don't have financial records. We need to patch together very fragmentary, very precarious information where we can from things like indulgences and other things. But it's not exactly firm, solid documentary knowledge, unfortunately. Yes?
I was struck by the separation of the laity from the elite and the canons and the way that the spaces are laid out. And what I wanted to know is the hospitals seem to be within the that district.
Mhm.
Were those hospitals, were laity present in those hospitals, or were those hospitals exclusively for the canons?
Oh, no, thank you. This question is about the hospitals attached to cathedrals. Those were for people, those were for laymen. The clergy would often have a function, so it would be like a merging of a church and hospital together, right? Medieval health, and I'm sure people in this audience are more expert in this than I, was largely through prayer. There wasn't much by way of medicine. Midwifery and other kinds of popular medicine were not necessarily encouraged by the ecclesiastical authorities, for whom the hope of a cure, right, came through the relics. And again, we have only tangential information on this, but it seems as though, for example, at a site such as Chartres, where in the crypt we have a sacred well, this well that goes back to antiquity, the Puits des Saints Forts, the well of the strong saints, and the relics may have been accessible to pilgrims all the time on some level. And if you've been to Chartres or looked at plans, you will have seen that there were stairways that went down by the west facade and also by the east end. So these were accessible to people even when the cathedral was, the main part might have been closed off. Whether people actually stayed down there, it's rather damp, I don't know, but it's possible. Yes, back there.
During the reconstruction of these buildings in later centuries, was there any attempt to recycle fragments of sculpture, or whether it was inside or outside, to, like patch, I guess you could say, or was it all new materials?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So we have fragments. Notre Dame in Paris is a great example. If you've been to what used to be called the Musée de Cluny, now it's called the Musée des Monuments du Moyen Âge. That museum is full of fragments of the sculpture of Notre Dame Cathedral. When Viollet-le-Duc, starting in 1847, began the restoration, all the sculpture was carved fresh. New. He tried to imitate, insofar as he could, the medieval models, but the whole approach was very different. The tools were different. No. In fact, I would say nowadays, because of acid rain and because of pollution, many sites are taking even their sculpture off the building and putting in a facsimile in its place in order to protect the originals from environmental damage. And that's happening over and over. And where it has not happened, take Wells Cathedral in England, right? The sculpture is just melting away like ice cream, disappearing under the damage that we inflict upon the planet. Mm-hmm. So, no, quite the opposite. Yeah, but what that means is that you can go to the cloisters, you can go to the Met, you can come to Duke University, we have a lot of medieval sculpture. All this flotsam and jetsam, right? Dispossessed objects that we try to then connect with their original location, sometimes with success, sometimes not. Yeah.
I'm wondering about the in the stratification of society, the place of the workers on the cathedral. Was there stratification there? Were there, particularly, I'm thinking of the stone cutters, who you could regard as artists. Were they regarded as artists, or at that level, or a notch under?
Right. Well, we don't have information, with one exception that I'll mention, about where workers would have been in the church. But we have, you have to recognize that they're not artists, that they are artisans, that they are, as you said, workers. The idea of the mason and the builder even the idea of the architect, right? This is a 15th century idea that we can tie to Alberti. Brunelleschi himself is a stonemason, as you probably know, with no particular social rank at all. I mean, it's only with this assertion of what I'll call the authorial persona of the architect by Alberti that begins to emerge a very different idea about architecture and the people who make it. This does not exist in the Middle Ages. Yeah. But when you said about the location of buildings, there's just one little tidbit I can offer you, which is kind of pathetic, but I'll do it anyway. And that is that one of the builders of Amiens Cathedral, Thomas de Courmont, when he dies, he asks to be buried where the water from the roof drips off through a gargoyle, so that he will benefit from the rain that hits the roof of the cathedral and comes down over his tomb outside the church, right? But nonetheless, a privileged position because of this flow of water from the church onto his tomb, which no longer survives. Yeah. Do we have time for one more, Darci? Any more questions? Yes.
I might add about the hospitals that the nurses were the nuns, of course. They often slept in close proximity to the ward or in the ward where the patients were. So they were 24/7 available. And their beds tended to be smaller and less comfortable than the patient's beds.
Oh, well, there it is. Lucky nuns. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. I'll see you later on.